the man you keep trying to become. You do not become that guy by improving the version of yourself that keeps betraying you. You become him when that version no longer has permission to speak for you. That is the part most people avoid, because it means the problem is not your schedule. It is not your morning routine. It is not your lack of information, discipline, confidence, or motivation. Those things matter, but they are not the root. They are tools. And tools become useless in the hands of a man who still identifies with weakness. This is why most self-improvement feels powerful for a few days, then disappears. You watch something. You feel exposed. You promise yourself that this time will be different. You clean your room, write a plan, start training, stop texting the wrong people, speak less, focus more. For a moment, it feels like a new life has started. Then ordinary pressure comes, a boring night, a small rejection, a difficult conversation, a tired morning, a person who knows exactly how to pull you back into your old emotional rhythm. And suddenly the new man disappears. The old one returns with familiar excuses, familiar cravings, familiar explanations. And the worst part is that he feels like home. That is the trap. The old self feels natural because you have rehearsed him for years. But natural does not mean true. Sometimes natural only means repeated. Sometimes natural means protected. Sometimes natural means your nervous system has mistaken survival for identity. You call it personality because calling it fear would demand too much honesty. That is why this title is dangerous. How to become that guy is not really a question about adding power. It is a question about removing weakness that has learned how to sound like you. There is a version of you that avoids confrontation and calls it peace. There is a version of you that delays action and calls it patience. There is a version of you that checks for attention and calls it curiosity. There is a version of you that stays available to people who drain you and calls it loyalty. There is a version of you that scrolls at night because silence would force you to meet the part of yourself you keep postponing. That version is not random. That version is an operating system. And until you uninstall it, every upgrade will crash. Most men want change to be gentle. They want the new identity without the death of the old one. They want confidence without losing the need to be approved. They want respect without abandoning the part of themselves that begs to be understood. They want silence without giving up the secret desire for people to notice their silence. That contradiction destroys them. A man cannot become respected while still needing everyone to confirm that he matters. He cannot become disciplined while keeping an environment designed for distraction. He cannot become untouchable while secretly hoping the people who hurt him are watching. He cannot become that guy while still negotiating with the emotional habits that made him ordinary. This is where the first cut happens. You are not trying to become someone new. You are trying to stop being someone old. That sounds similar, but it is not. Becoming someone new still lets you fantasize. It lets you imagine an upgraded version of your current self. It lets you keep the same fears, the same hunger, the same soft permissions, but dress them in better language. Stopping who you were is colder. It asks what you are no longer allowed to do, who you are no longer allowed to entertain, and what excuse no longer gets a place at the table. This is why real transformation feels like betrayal. You must betray the self that protected you when you were weaker. The self that learned how to survive by pleasing, explaining, hiding, chasing, postponing, and pretending not to care. That self may have helped you survive certain rooms, but now he is trying to rule your future. And if you remain loyal to him, you will keep calling survival wisdom while your potential rots behind it. When a man has decided, he stops leaking. His words stop begging. His silence stops performing. His boundaries stop asking permission. His focus stops depending on mood. He may still feel fear, doubt, loneliness, and uncertainty, but those things no longer sit on the throne. Most people are not ruled by their goals. They are ruled by what they permit. Permission to delay, permission to relapse, permission to explain weakness as depth, permission to remain available to what lowers them, permission to call avoidance peace, permission to call comfort self-care when it is really self-abandonment. If permission built the old self, refusal builds the new one. But refusal is not glamorous. It happens in small moments. It happens when nobody claps. It happens when the old relief appears and you do not reach for it. It happens when you let the silence hurt without using someone else's anesthesia. It happens when you keep your promise after the feeling that made the promise is gone. That is where the new man begins. Not in public, not in announcement, not in motivation. In the private moment where the old self expects access and finds the door locked. And this is where most men fail. They make change emotional instead of structural. They feel something strong, then believe that feeling is proof. But intensity is not transformation. Fire can start movement, but it cannot build identity. A man can feel disgusted with his life at midnight and still wake up loyal to the same pattern. The mind does not respect intensity. It respects evidence. Every action is evidence. Every broken promise is evidence. Every boundary you collapse is evidence. Every time you return to what weakens you, you train your identity to expect surrender. So the first step is not to add more goals. It is to identify the version of you that keeps winning when pressure arrives. Name him without drama. See him without pity. Watch where he appears. Watch the people who awaken him. Watch the excuses he uses to sound reasonable. Because the man you are trying to become is not hidden by lack of ability. He is buried under permissions you have not revoked. The identity that keeps dragging you back. The old self survives because he knows how to make weakness feel reasonable. He does not always say, quit. Sometimes he says, rest. He does not always say, avoid the hard conversation. Sometimes he says, protect your peace. He does not always say, you are afraid. Sometimes he says, this is not the right time. And because the voice sounds calm, you mistake it for wisdom. That is how identity hides. It rarely appears as a villain. It appears as your most believable explanation. It speaks in the language you already trust. If you see yourself as misunderstood, it will use pain. If you see yourself as independent, it will use pride. If you see yourself as logical, it will use analysis. If you see yourself as deep, it will use complexity until doing nothing feels intelligent. To become that guy, you have to stop using insight as a blanket and start using it as a blade. Insight should cut excuses. It should not make them sound sophisticated. If you know why you chase, but you still chase, knowledge has become theater. If you know why you over-explain, but still beg to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you, awareness has become another way to avoid command. The first layer of psychology is identity. You act like the person you believe you are, not the person you want to be, not the person you admire, not the person you describe when the music is playing and your chest feels heavy. The person you believe you are when pressure removes the performance. That belief becomes the ceiling. If you believe you are the man who starts and quits, every beginning carries an expiration date. If you believe people eventually leave, you will cling too hard or detach too early, then call the result proof. If you believe you are not respected, you will scan every room for insult until your insecurity finds one. The world is not always confirming your identity. Sometimes your identity is editing the world. That is why two men can enter the same situation and live different realities. One sees a challenge, the other sees humiliation. One hears criticism, the other hears an attack on his worth. One sees silence as space, the other sees abandonment. The event is the same, but the self behind the eyes changes everything. And perception is never neutral when identity is wounded. This is why a man who has not examined himself is easy to control. Push the right button and he reacts. Withdraw attention and he chases. Doubt him and he over-explains. Praise him and he becomes dependent. Ignore him and he loses center. He believes he is choosing, but most of the time he is defending an identity he never consciously selected. Someone found the button, but you installed it. That line does not mean people did not hurt you. It means if a wound still decides your behavior, the wound has become an authority, and anything that can command you owns part of you. This is why becoming that guy cannot be reduced to looking calm. A man can look calm and still be enslaved inside. He can be silent because he is centered, or silent because he wants to punish. He can walk away because he respects himself, or walk away because he hopes someone will chase. He can train because he has standards, or train because he is still trying to make someone regret how they saw him. Same behavior, different master. That is the part no one tells you. The outside action does not reveal the whole truth. The motive underneath matters. If your discipline is built on revenge, then the people who hurt you are still inside the structure. If your silence is built on resentment, then your silence is not power, it is a message. If your confidence depends on being seen as confident, then you are still being ruled by the room. The old self can wear new clothes. He can wear discipline. He can wear detachment. He can wear ambition. He can wear silence. He can wear, I do not care. But if the hunger underneath is still approval, then all you have done is upgrade the costume. So you must ask what is really driving you. Do you want discipline? or do you want revenge? Do you want silence, or do you want control over how they feel? Do you want respect, or do you want proof that you were never small? Do you want freedom, or do you want a better-looking cage? Most men never ask this because the answer would collapse their performance. They prefer to call it ambition. But sometimes ambition is only a wound that learned business language. Sometimes discipline is only fear of being ordinary. Sometimes detachment is only attachment, trying to protect itself from shame. Sometimes confidence is only insecurity with better posture. This does not mean the work is fake. It means the work is unfinished. Pain can wake you up, but it cannot remain the throne. Revenge can get you moving, but it cannot become your god. Humiliation can create the first break, but if you keep feeding from it, you will need enemies forever. That is not sovereignty. That is dependency with a harder face. A sovereign man does not need the world to regret underestimating him. He does not need the room to validate his transformation. His center of gravity has moved back inside himself. That is rare, because most people are still negotiating with wounds they pretend are preferences. They say they like being alone when they are terrified of being rejected. They say they do not care when they check every reaction. They say they are focused when they are secretly addicted to proving. They say they are healing when they are only avoiding the next risk. Human nature protects the story that hurts the least today. And that is why the old identity keeps dragging you back. It does not need to defeat your future. It only needs to offer relief in the present. One easier night, one familiar person, one comfortable excuse, one return to the old role. That is how relapse happens. Not as a dramatic fall, as a soft agreement. You agree that today does not count. You agree that this message is harmless. You agree that one skipped promise means nothing. You agree that you can keep the same inputs and somehow produce a different man. But your life is not shaped by what you announce. It is shaped by what you allow. And what you allow repeatedly becomes identity. The human fear of becoming more. The deepest fear is not that you will fail. Failure is familiar. Failure lets you explain yourself. Failure lets people comfort you. Failure gives you a story that others understand. It hurts, but it also protects you, because failure allows you to remain close to the person you already know. Success is more dangerous. Success removes the excuse. That is why many men are not truly afraid of losing. They are afraid of what life will demand once they stop losing. They are afraid of becoming visible. They are afraid of being responsible for the level they claimed they wanted. They are afraid of standing in a life where their old explanations no longer work. As long as you are capable of more, you can live in fantasy. Potential is comfortable because it asks nothing today. You can feel special without being disciplined. You can imagine greatness without being judged by its demands. You can say, I know I could become more. And that sentence gives you a small emotional reward, as if recognizing potential were the same as converting it. But potential that remains unused eventually becomes poison. It turns into envy. It turns into resentment. It turns into bitterness toward people who were less talented but more consistent. It turns into silent anger when someone else becomes what you kept postponing. You tell yourself they were lucky, fake, arrogant, privileged, or obsessed. Sometimes that may be true, but your reaction still reveals something. You are not only judging them, you are defending yourself from the standard they represent. That will make people angry because it touches ego. Not all criticism is envy, and not every successful person deserves admiration. But much of what people call discernment is wounded comparison, wearing a clean shirt. The ego downgrades what threatens it, because downgrading is easier than rising. That is human nature. We protect the self-image before we pursue the truth. This is why transformation is terrifying. It does not only ask you to work harder, it asks you to stop receiving the emotional benefits of weakness. And weakness has benefits. It gives you sympathy. It gives you lowered expectations. It gives you a reason not to risk humiliation. It gives you a way to remain understood by people who would feel threatened if you changed. That is the hidden contract. Every environment has one. Every friend group, family system, relationship, and social circle has an invisible agreement about what level of ambition, honesty, discipline, and self-respect is acceptable. Stay within that agreement, and you belong. Rise above it, and suddenly you become strange, too serious, too intense, too different, too proud. People may not hate your growth. They may hate what your growth says about their refusal to move. Your evolution becomes a mirror, and not everyone wants a mirror. Some people only loved the version of you that made their own life feel safe. They knew how to talk to that version. They knew what you would tolerate. They knew which guilt worked. They knew how long you would explain yourself before folding. When you change, the contract breaks. That is why becoming that guy can feel lonely before it feels powerful. You are not only changing habits, you are changing your emotional position in other people's lives. You are no longer available for the same games. You no longer laugh at the same weakness. You no longer mistake access for love. You no longer make your life smaller so others do not feel confronted. Some people will call that arrogance. Sometimes they will be right, because growth can become performance. But often, what they call arrogance is simply the sound of a man no longer asking permission. This is the sovereignty tax. To become that guy, you pay with comfort, approval, and old belonging. You pay by losing the sympathy attached to weakness. You pay by losing the identity of being easy. You pay by losing the ability to blame the same things forever. You pay by accepting that some people were attached to your manageability, not your growth. No one pays that tax for you. This is why the old self bargains so hard. It knows what change will cost. It knows that if you truly become disciplined, you cannot keep calling inconsistency harmless. If you become respected, you cannot keep entertaining disrespect for the sake of comfort. If you become clear, you cannot keep using confusion as an excuse to stay inactive. Growth removes hiding places, and human beings love hiding places. They hide inside busyness. They hide inside humor. They hide inside being misunderstood. They hide inside endless planning. They hide inside pain. Some pain is real, but real pain can still become a hiding place if you keep using it to avoid responsibility. That is the deeper fear, not failure. Self-authorship. Freedom sounds beautiful until you realize it means you can no longer wait for someone to rescue your potential. Nobody is coming to force your standards into existence. Nobody is coming to remove the people you keep allowing back in. Nobody is coming to close the apps, train your body, protect your focus, or speak the truth for you. You wanted freedom, but freedom hands the pen back to you. Many men would rather keep blaming the lock than face what they would do with the key. That is why becoming that guy is a change in authorship. You stop living as a reaction to what happened to you, who doubted you, who left, who failed to see you. You stop making your identity a courtroom where the past is always on trial. At some point, the trial must end, not because they were innocent, because you need your life back. This is what the old self hates. The old self needs the case to remain open. As long as the case is open, he has evidence. Evidence for hesitation, evidence for mistrust, evidence for anger, evidence for staying guarded, evidence for never fully risking himself again. But evidence can become a cage. And if you live too long inside the case against the world, you eventually become unable to build anything outside it. That is why closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop asking the wound to explain your future. The old self will try to return through performance. He will say, become strong so they notice. He will say, become silent so they regret. He will say, become successful so they feel small. He will try to use your growth as another way to keep them at the center. That is the next trap, because if they are still the center, you are not free. You are only improving inside their shadow. The elimination protocol. There is a moment when a man stops trying to improve and starts removing. That moment changes everything. Improvement says, I want to be better. Removal says, this can no longer exist. Improvement negotiates with the old self. Removal locks the door. Improvement can still be emotional. Removal becomes structural. It changes the environment, the permissions, the people, the rituals, and the identity that certain behaviors are allowed to belong to. That is the elimination protocol. You do not make the old self weaker by arguing with him. You make him impossible to access. A man who keeps the same phone beside the bed, the same friends normalizing mediocrity, the same content feeding comparison, the same late-night habits, the same weak access to people who drain him, and the same excuses around pressure is not transforming. He is decorating the old house while the foundation rots. The fire is not lack of desire. The fire is the dead identity you keep refusing to bury. Most men hate this because it sounds restrictive. They want freedom. But what they call freedom is usually access to their own weakness. Freedom to scroll, freedom to relapse, freedom to explain, freedom to return, freedom to keep every door open in case discipline becomes uncomfortable. That is not freedom. That is a prison with a wider hallway. Real freedom begins when the lowest version of you loses access. This is why you must burn certain exits. Not dramatically, not for attention, quietly. Delete the conversation you keep rereading. Remove the app that keeps turning your mind into a marketplace. Stop sitting in the environment where your old behavior is automatic. Stop telling your plans to people who reward your announcement more than your execution. The old self survives through access. Cut access, and he starts starving. That is not cruelty. That is mercy toward your future. The elimination protocol begins with 3 questions. What makes the old self easy? What makes the new self difficult? What permission keeps repeating the same life? These questions are simple, but they are not soft. They expose the architecture of your defeat. Maybe the old self is easy because your room is built for distraction. Maybe the old self is easy because your friends mock seriousness. Maybe the old self is easy because you keep emotional doors open to people who only return when they need to feel powerful. Maybe the old self is easy because you talk about change instead of protecting it. That last one matters. Do not announce your transformation too early. When you speak before the identity is stable, your brain receives a reward. People react. They praise. They doubt. They ask questions. Suddenly, your private reconstruction becomes a public performance. Now you are managing perception instead of building congruence. The work becomes infected by audience. That guy does not announce himself. He arrives. By the time people notice, the transformation is no longer a promise. It is evidence. It is written into posture, decisions, restraint, focus, and the absence of old explanations. The work was done in the dark because the dark protects what is still forming. This is not secrecy from shame. It is silence as containment. But elimination alone is not enough. You also need non-negotiables, not goals. Goals are things you hope to reach. Non-negotiables are things you do not violate without consequences. A goal says, I want to train this week. A non-negotiable says, I am not the man who misses. A goal says, I want to stop chasing. A non-negotiable says, I do not trade my self-respect for access to someone inconsistent. A goal bends under pressure. A non-negotiable makes pressure reveal you. Pick 3, not 10. A man with 10 standards usually has none. Choose the few actions that define the identity you are building. Training, focus, truth, deep work, emotional restraint, clean environment. No contact with what humiliates your standard. Whatever they are, they must be few enough to remember and serious enough to defend. Then protect them from your own excuses. Because the first enemy will not be the world. It will be your ability to rationalize. You will say one miss does not matter. You will say one reply is harmless. You will say one more night of distraction is understandable. You will say you are tired, stressed, misunderstood, lonely, or not ready. And some of that may be true, but the old self does not need a big victory. He only needs a precedent. 1 violation teaches him where the border opens. 2 violations teach him the guard is weak. 3 violations become a campaign. Soon you are not slipping. You are voting. Every action is a vote, but every exception is a vote too. This does not mean perfection. Perfection is another trap, because it makes one mistake feel like total collapse. The point is not never falling. The point is never letting the fall become a new identity. Correct quickly, without drama, without self-pity, without needing a motivational ceremony to return. That is maturity. Maturity is not being emotionless. It is no longer letting emotion have executive power. Fear can be present and not decide. Desire can be present and not command. Anger can be present and not drive. Loneliness can be present and not lower your standard. That is when people begin to feel something different from you, not because you are trying to project mystery, but because you are no longer leaking chaos. You are not asking the room to stabilize you. You are not using attention as proof of existence. You are not giving your wounds the microphone. Presence is not mystery. Presence is congruence. When a man's identity and actions point in the same direction long enough, the gap closes. And when the gap closes, temptation loses openings. It cannot enter through inconsistency because the door is gone. It cannot enter through approval because approval is no longer the master. It cannot enter through comfort because comfort has lost voting rights. That is the congruence lock. You become that guy permanently when acting beneath your standard feels less like a mistake and more like wearing someone else's skin. The man who becomes unowned. The final form of becoming that guy is not dominance. It is ownership of self. Not ownership in the loud, motivational sense. Not shouting about discipline. Not trying to look superior. Not turning your pain into an aesthetic. Ownership means the center of your life has returned to you. Your choices are no longer arranged around proving, pleasing, punishing, or being perceived. That is why the man becomes difficult to control. He has fewer hooks. You cannot easily move him with praise because praise is no longer food. You cannot easily break him with criticism because criticism is no longer an identity threat. You cannot easily pull him back with guilt because guilt no longer outranks truth. You cannot easily seduce him with comfort because he has already seen what comfort costs. The old self was always negotiating. Should I speak so they understand me? Should I stay so they do not leave? Should I reply so they do not think I am weak? Should I prove myself so they regret it? Should I soften my standard so I am easier to love? That life is exhausting, and many men mistake exhaustion for depth. They think their endless internal conflict means they are complex. Sometimes it only means they have not decided. Complexity can be real, but indecision often hides inside it. A clear man may still feel deeply, but he does not let every feeling reopen the court. The verdict has already been given. I am no longer that person. Not as an affirmation, as law. This is the part no one can do for you. People can inspire you, pain can awaken you, a video can expose you, a betrayal can harden you, a failure can shake you, but none of those things can replace the moment you decide what is no longer available inside your own life. That decision is private, and that is why it is powerful. Nobody needs to witness it for it to be real. In fact, if you need witnesses too early, it probably is not real yet. The man who is truly changing does not need applause at the beginning because he is not trying to be seen changing. He is trying to make change inevitable. At first, nobody notices. Then they notice all at once. They notice you answer differently. They notice your pauses are heavier. They notice you do not chase the same approval. They notice you are harder to guilt. They notice you do not explain every absence. They notice you can be kind without being available, calm without being passive, focused without being performative. Some will respect it. Some will resent it. Both reveal the truth. Respect usually recognizes alignment. Resentment often mourns lost control. Do not confuse the two. The people who benefited from your old self may call your new standard selfish. They may say, you changed. They may be right. You did change. That is the point. But do not become drunk on that reaction. If their resentment becomes your reward, they still own you. If your transformation still needs their regret, they still own you. If you keep checking whether the old world noticed the new man, the old world is still your mirror. Break the mirror. That guy does not become free because everyone sees him differently. He becomes free because he stops requiring reflection. This is the final psychological shift. The transformation begins with identity, moves through elimination, survives through congruence, but matures through detachment from audience. You are not doing the work so the room changes temperature. You are doing the work so your internal temperature no longer depends on the room. That is power, quiet power, not the kind that needs to be announced, not the kind that performs darkness, not the kind that confuses mystery with emptiness, the kind that appears when a man has stopped abandoning himself in small ways, because that is where life is usually lost. Small abandonments, a promise broken quietly, a boundary softened privately, a standard delayed until tomorrow, a truth swallowed to preserve an image, a return to a person who makes the old self feel alive, a comfort chosen because the new identity felt too cold that night. This is why becoming that guy is less dramatic than people imagine. It is not a movie scene. It is not a sudden rebirth. It is the steady removal of everything inside you that still asks weakness for permission. Every day, you revoke something. The right to over-explain, the right to chase, the right to disappear into distraction, the right to use pain as a personality, the right to call avoidance peace, the right to keep an environment that feeds the man you say you no longer are. Then, slowly, the old self loses language. He still knocks, but he has fewer arguments. He still offers relief, but the relief looks expensive now. He still tells you it would be easier to go back, but going back no longer feels like home. It feels like self-betrayal. That is when you know the identity has shifted, not when you feel strong, when weakness feels foreign. And even then, you do not become perfect. You become responsible. You still feel fear, but fear does not command. You still feel loneliness, but loneliness does not lower your standards. You still feel anger, but anger does not become your driver. You still feel the old pull, but the old pull no longer has authority. That is the hierarchy of command. The wound can speak. It cannot rule. The ego can complain. It cannot steer. The past can explain. It cannot own. This is what it means to become that guy. Not the fantasy version, not the social media version, not the cold, empty version that pretends not to care. The real version. The man whose life has become difficult for his old self to enter. And maybe that is why he feels rare. Most men are not missing potential. They are protecting the identity that blocks it. They are not waiting for more information. They are waiting for change to cost less. They are not trapped by life as much as they are attached to the permissions that make life familiar. So do not ask how long it takes. Ask what still has access. Ask what you keep calling personality because you are afraid to call it fear. Ask what comfort you keep defending because losing it would expose your responsibility. Ask what relationship, habit, story, or hidden motive still feeds the old self. Then remove its permission. That is how the man appears. Not by adding more, by leaving less for weakness to use. And one day, when the old self reaches for the door, he will find nothing there. No handle, no key, no way back.